Well, it's 3 o'clock. I think we can go ahead and start. I'm sure there'll be some other folks that'll come in. I'm Michael Kenyon. I'm President and CEO of the National Association of Charitable Gift Planners, and welcome to our town hall on Friday afternoon. This is our first event with a guest speaker, and we're going to move to that format. Every 2 weeks, we're going to have a town hall at 3 o'clock on Friday and have a guest speaker and provide that opportunity for you as members to have the opportunity to talk with the speaker and have some dialogue amongst ourselves. So the informal format, I hope you find enjoyable and a little bit different than some of our other formats that we do. So kind of rules of the road. Thank you everyone for being muted. Continue to be muted. I believe Russell's going to talk for a little bit, and then we open up for dialogue. If you would raise your hand, use the queue at the bottom of your screen where you can see down there, and you can have the opportunity there to raise your hand, and then we'll call on you. And then if you'd unmute, ask your question, and then we'll keep moving through and try and take the questions in order. At this time, I'd like to introduce our Chair of the Board of Directors, Kent Weimer. Welcome, Kent. Thanks for doing another session with us.
Thank you. So good to be here and so good to see so many friends. We have some other fellow board members on here. Bob Safis, I see Nathan Stelter has joined us. So good to see everybody. So today's is a little bit different, and we have the pleasure of having Dr. Russell James with us. He's the CH Foundation Chair of Personal Financial Planning at Texas Tech University. He is a thought leader in the field of philanthropy. He has done extensive research and many presentations about charitable giving. In my opinion, one of the most impactful was his presentation based on his research, Cash is Not King. If you have not seen that, you need to see that. And you need to give that to all of your major gift officers so they understand how to be effective in this field. I first met Russell several years ago when he did a presentation at our local Dallas Council. And today he's going to spend a little bit of time talking about his recent article that was published in the UC Davis Law Review. We will then open it up for questions. And as Michael said, if you have a question, want to make a comment, use the raise your hand feature and Michael will call on you in order. So with that, please welcome our guest, Dr. Russell James.
Okay, thanks so much. Well, I appreciate the opportunity to share with you today. This is going to be a little bit different. And so I'm going to be relying more on you here rather than if you've ever been to one of my presentations, I sort of describe it as just like fire hose, right? I'm just like trying to put out massive information in a short period of time. Today, I'm going to go over some of the things that I think are more interesting about the findings, but I'm really interested in generating some conversations about how this can be helpful. Because in other words, there's a lot of this that is not going to surprise you guys, right? Like, I knew that. I've been seeing that for 20 years. You know, you're late to the party here, Russell, that kind of thing. But it's more the idea of, okay, now that we've got this, how do we use it to help folks who are in plan giving and to encourage organizations to invest in that space? So what I thought I would do is present some concepts, some results, and then we'll stop for a little while, see if folks have thoughts, reactions, comments. If things die down, you know, any of you who know me know that I'm just not going to stop talking. So I'll go with another segment of stuff, and we'll keep doing that until the clock runs out. So let me go ahead. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here just to give a little bit of a couple of the details from the new pieces, and then again I'll stop, see if we can get some conversation going, and then if that ends, then we'll go on to some other findings. So this is of course the big news that I'm hoping will be helpful in terms of getting decision makers to understand the importance of planned giving, because there's always this conflict with gift planning where you've got managers who maybe are only planning to be with the organization for 3 to 5 years. And so even if you convince them it's a great investment, it may be a great investment in planned giving, but they're going to be on to the next organization by then. So this was a result that I've been sharing various versions of it for a number of years, but it's been about a 1.5 year process to go through to actually get it formally published in a top 25 law review to say, you know, look, this is not just something on a slide somewhere. So the basic idea is this. This is a comparison, and the important thing to keep in mind is that these are the same people. So these are the same people before and after they added a charitable component into their estate plan. So, I mean, it's not a surprise to say people who have a charitable component are more charitable daily. That's not a surprise. That's not particularly interesting. That's not what this is saying. This is saying if you take those same human beings and you look at what they were doing before they added a charitable component, and then you look at what those same people were doing after they added a charitable component, there is this substantial, fairly dramatic, and sustained increase in their current giving. So you see the chart here. The results are, it's about, on average, about a 77% increase, and that's inflation adjusted. So these are all real dollars that we're looking at here. And we've got, this is based on about 9,000 observations, and it's from a nationally representative in-person study. So sort of the gold standard when it comes to social science research. By the way, the reason that most studies aren't nationally representative and in person is that it's insanely expensive to do this. This study, the health and retirement study, that just happened to have this charitable component in it, it's part of the largest federal grant in the history of the University of Michigan to administer this study. And so it's you know, very high quality, but also very expensive to get those sorts of things. Okay, so this is the fundamental result. Another piece of it is, and this is just more on the data side to understand that, look, if we look at this result, it's possible that that's driven by a few very large donors. Turns out it's not, okay? One of the ways we can see that is from these next results, which is that if we don't look at the average amount of giving, if we just look at the tendency for people to give at least $1,000 or more. Now, the reason this number confirms what we're seeing is that it's not subject to influence by these very wealthy outliers, right? In other words, it's just a yes or no. Are you giving more than $1,000 a year to organizations? So whether that's yes, I'm giving 1,500, or yes, I'm giving 15 million, it's just a yes, okay? And we see also a big bump that happens there. On average, those before they add charity to their estate plan who are given at least $1,000 a year, it's 51% of the group was before they added charity to the estate plan. And then after they added charity to the estate plan, about 62% of that same group is giving at least $1,000 a year. So again, same people before and after, not just the average goes up, but the propensity to give goes up. Now, just another kind of a wonky side note here. This is kind of a big deal because typically what we see with national data is that the propensity to give goes up with age until you hit right around 70, maybe 75, and then it goes down. This group that is in these 2, 4, 6, and 8 years after they added charity to the estate plan, they're in that age group that should be going down in their propensity. And we see it going just the opposite. Now, Kent mentioned the last year's study, which focused on current giving from gifts of assets. And the big sort of what I like is the headline of that. And of course, it's a whole academic paper and happy to do an hour presentation on that. But I like this comparison a lot. And this is showing the 5-year average growth in total fundraising from all nonprofits that are raising over $1 million a year, tracking them from 2010 to 2015. Those that were raising gifts only from cash, their average fundraising growth total contributions was 11%. That's also the combined total rate of inflation over that 5-year period. So what that means is that nonprofits that are raising gifts only from cash during that 5-year period, they kept up with inflation. That was it. Then we look at the right-hand side, nonprofits that were raising gifts, including gifts from securities. Those nonprofits grew their fundraising about 6-fold faster. Okay, so it was this massive, massive difference. You know, in academic research, we're used to looking at statistically significant differences that actually don't make that much of a difference in real life, whereas this difference was really, really massive. Now, I bring that back up because I kind of want to talk about this idea that maybe we're seeing the same thing with both of these results, because they look very different at the beginning. Get a gift in your will, you get a gift in the will, and the current giving goes up. Raise money from gifts of assets, and the long-term fundraising gets a lot better. But I'm thinking maybe that what we're seeing here, and maybe this is a way to have a conversation with leadership about planned giving, that is talking about planned giving in terms of gifts of wealth, gifts of assets. The idea that what is transformational for an organization or for a donor is to shift the mindset from giving out of pocket change, right? Giving out of disposable income, and to instead start thinking about giving from wealth. And that kind of mental accounting is potentially a huge driver for transforming the individual donor, for transforming the organization. So mental accounting is this idea, and the last year, the Nobel Prize in Economics went to Dick Thaler, who sort of popularized, invented this concept. And it's basically the idea that, look, you know, in math, a dollar is a dollar, but in story, it's all about the labels attached to the dollars. And that when you make a new category, donation relevant, that it can really transform giving. And that can be as simple as the first time that you give furniture or clothes to a charity shop because you're getting ready to move. From that point forward, whenever you've got that opportunity to give, there is this natural tendency to think about giving when it comes to those items, right? We're going to redecorate, we think about giving those items. But that the same thing can happen with, say, gifts of appreciated assets, like shares of stock or ownership in a business or real estate, especially when people do it the first time and they realize, oh, wait a second, I didn't have to pay those capital gains taxes. You know, so whenever they start thinking about, oh, going to have to pay those capital gains taxes, that charity, that the nonprofit will come to mind. And that can be a really big deal, because we see in experiments that people are much, much more generous with unearned, irregular income, sort of what you might think of as windfall income, than they are with just regular earnings. And so that, you know, that fits with the experiments. So I want to stop here for a minute before I'm talking more about some other results, and give me just a second to unshare my screen here. And I want to open it up for thoughts or comments about any of this. And you would think I would be Zoom literate by this point. And I know there's a magic button I can press here. Give me just a second. And there it is. Stop share. Okay, great. So Michael, I'll turn it over to you for a bit, and then I can jump back in with some more statistics if this conversation calms down any.
All right, very good. At this point, go ahead and raise your hand if you have questions or comments.
Let me just make a real quick comment. If you haven't read the article that Russell had published in the UC Davis Law Review, The link to it was in the invitation that went out for this meeting. I would encourage you to read it because it has a lot of this information in it, plus a lot of other information.
Okay, well, I can give folks a little bit of time to think, and I can talk about a couple of other points if there's nobody wants to share a comment at this point.
We've got one here, and it is Ken Wolf. Ken, would you go ahead?
Thanks, Russell. Just a comment: the Cash is King. I watched that through Stelter and then shared it with our major gift staff, and the response was amazing. I think the challenge is how to get beyond that aha moment to making it part of their day-to-day thinking. But it was really transformational for them. I mean, I share stuff all the time, but that got a better response. So I think you're really onto something. It's not only important information, but it seemed to resonate with our major gift staff. So just want to make that comment.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. And I don't know, let me share something because you brought up, and give me just a second here. Let me go back and share my screen. Let me share something that I did yesterday. So I'm now doing a weekly training session with our fundraisers at Texas Tech and the hospital here and the hospital in El Paso and a couple of our affiliated universities. And so yesterday I was sharing with them some of these pieces. And one of the things that, and I don't know if this is helpful or not, but this is what I shared with them on the how to start, because there's this idea of, oh yeah, that makes sense. But then there's also this fear, right? A lot of fundraisers, the idea of asking for something other than write a check is just really scary. And so usually we'll start with just a very simple, here's why a gift of stock of publicly traded security is better for the donor than a gift of cash. So I use this slide about sharing stories, being a resource, and listening. Listening, if there's an upcoming sale, retirement, inheritance, these are all times for charitable planning. Be a resource. If people ask what you do, just say, I help donors give smarter, right? Because that's the sort of response that generates a question. Okay, well, how do you do that? Well, then you could share a story about somebody who made an interesting gift of an asset and how they avoided the capital gains tax, and everybody was happy and they made a big impact and all of that. And obviously the donor stories can include stories about stocks, bonds, real estate, transfers of business. And what we see from experimental research is that even with complex gifts, as long as we're sharing a story that the donor feels like is someone like them, then those stories are particularly influential. If we can communicate that people like me do things like this to a donor, in other words, people like that particular donor do things like this, that can be powerful. So just a quick add-on to your comment.
I like the simplicity of that, so thanks.
Great. Okay, any others before we look at some other statistics?
I think we can go ahead.
Okay, great. Also, quick shout out to Lisa Garrison. Thanks for being on the call today. And somebody mentioned you had other things going on, and hope it's helpful. Okay, so let me talk about some other things. So I started out with, that's the wrong presentation. So I started out with the happy stuff. Now let me share some other things. One of the things that we learned from this and other data is that the ultimate dollars coming out the other end, they are about decisions made near the end of life. Now, don't get me wrong. I think it's fantastic to get in the plan early. Obviously, that does great things for the current giving, transforms the donor's mindset, and those gifts, even the estate gifts, tend to be larger the longer that they've been in the plan. So that's all good. I'm a big fan of getting in the plan early, but there's a lot of end-of-life instability in the charitable estate planning component. So let me throw out some findings that show this. It's in the U.S., 61% of those, and there's about 14,000 in this study who have passed away, that we know actually what happened to their estates after they died. 61% of those who actually transferred dollars to charity in their estates indicated at some point within the last 5 years of their life that they affirmatively indicated, I do not have a charitable component in my estate plan, okay? And so that was sort of a hint that, okay, a bunch of people seem to be adding within the last 5 years of life. Not only within the last 5 years, but even with the last 2, running an analysis using the 12,000 folks who had passed away in the 2012, by 2012, 40% of those who actually transferred dollars to charity at death indicated within 2 years of death that at that point, they had not yet put a charitable component in the estate plan. So it's not all good news. It's not all adding going on. There's also a lot of dropping going on. In particular, there's a lot of dropping going on near the end of life, but just in general. So this is looking at the 10-year retention of a charitable estate component. So in other words, what we're looking at here is people who are in the study, and this is longitudinal study, so it tracks those same people for the rest of their lives, okay, every 2 years. So these are people who said, yes, I have a charitable component in my estate plan. And then 10 years later, among all of those who are still answering the question, right? So it could be 100% that still have a charitable component, but it's not. It's about 55%. And the remarkable thing about this 10-year retention period, this 10-year retention, is that it's actually crazy consistent. If you compare, for example, people from 94 to 2004, 95 to 2005, 98 to 2008, all the way up to 2006 to 2016, which is our most recent final version data. Very consistent results. It's about a 55% retention rate. Now, that suggests there's a lot of instability in the charitable component of the estate plan. Now, part of the reason for this, frankly, is that, and fundraisers don't understand this because they don't understand how estate planning works in the lawyer's office. So I can tell you this from my practice and having presented for a lot of estate planning practitioners, the majority of them follow this same practice. If you come in, or when I was in private practice and estate planning, if you came into my office with your old will document and you wanted to make an estate plan, what I was interested in was what your assets were, what your family was, what you wanted to plan. I did not care what was in your old will document because the first thing we were going to do was revoke it. Unless there was some issue where you perhaps were lacking capacity to revoke it, then it served no purpose. So it served no purpose for me to charge you billable hours to read through and try to translate that old document that you brought in with you. The first thing we're going to do is revoke it. Plus, it was probably some malpractice because I didn't do it, right? It's not my document. So the idea that these charitable components just automatically bleed over, it's not how it works. Look, we're not out there. If somebody comes in with their old will document, the last thing I'm going to do is start adding codicils to that thing. There's no way, right? You start over again from scratch. What that means is that there's a lot less carryover than you might think. Now, from a marketing perspective, this means you need to stay top of the mind, because if people aren't thinking about charity, then it doesn't end up in the plan. And we know that from, for example, the UK data that shows us that just asking the question, would you like to leave anything to charity, more than doubles the share of people who are including charity in their will documents when they're going through their normal estate planning process. You know, of course, if you ask it using a social norm, many of our customers like to include a gift to charity in their wills, then you're going to triple that share of people who are including gifts. But just asking the question doubles it. So you got to stay top of the mind. Here's another example. This is from a nationally representative sample of probate records in Australia. And again, here, this is the age that the document was signed that actually controlled the charitable dollars. 76% of charitable bequest dollars are controlled by will documents signed at age 80 or older. Okay, so this is an end of life, ultimately controlled type of decision, and there's a lot of fluidity in that decision. Some other things that we saw from that data, just to dive down a little bit more, is that the average time between will execution and death was 10 years for non-charitable wills. It was about half that for charitable wills. So these end-of-life decisions tend to be more charitable. And actually, over a quarter of charitable wills in that national sample were signed within 12 months of death. Most of them were signed within 4 years of death. Now, I'm just pointing this out because what we're getting here is greater confidence in these results because we're getting triangulation. We don't have national level probate data in the US, but they do in Australia, and it's matching what we're seeing in the HRS, which is this charitable decision. It's a fluid decision, but in particular, it is an end-of-life decision. Now, getting back to the article itself, we've got information in there. We can track people in the years leading up to death. And this is important because let me point out a couple of different trends, and maybe you all can share some thoughts and comments about these trends. So this top part, these are decedents who actually transferred dollars to charity. And this bottom part, these are decedents who did not transfer dollars to charity. Now, I want you to notice, if you go back, you know, all the way to the right-hand side, this is 15 to, 15 or more years before they died, okay? These were donors, right? 57% were donors. But if you go to this last 2 to 4 years, you're looking at 39% were donors. Most of these people who actually transferred dollars to death at charity, they weren't giving in the last, say 4 years prior to death. Now that's important because this is the golden window, right? This is when the final plans actually get made that actually control those documents, those dollars that go to charity. And this is a big deal because these people, when they are in this magic window, they're not giving, they're certainly not volunteering. Look, only 10% are still volunteering in the last 2 years of life, whereas 37% were if you go back a few years, okay? The issue is we've got charities that communicate with their older friends, not just suboptimally, they're doing it exactly precisely wrong because they're communicating based upon recency of donation, right? Charities all do that. Well, we're communicating based on recency of donation. What that means is that you're guaranteed for the majority of your charitable bequest donors, you're guaranteed to go radio silent right at the moment when they are entering that window that actually controls the dollars, that makes those decisions. So this is, I think, a big deal. One other thing, let me point out here that this is a cognition test. It's a 20-word recall score. How many, you get a list of words, how many words, a list of 10 words, how many can you recall immediately, and then you have 5 minutes of other tasks, and then how many can you recall again, okay? So what we see here is, number one, our charitable bequest donors at every stage prior to death, they score higher than those who are not charitable bequest donors. But I think it's important then when we're looking at this sort of golden window of opportunity where there's all of this fluidity in the charitable component of the estate plan, we've got to keep the messages simple. I mean, look, as much as I love writing the most crazy tax wonky, articles about how we can do this and isn't this cool and all that sort of thing. I think we've got to keep in mind that when it comes to these actual gifts and wills and trusts or TODs or non-probate transfers, just the simple gifts, that we need to stay top of the mind, but we need to be simple, right? We don't need to be winning any awards for complexity in messaging, especially given with this age stratification. So look, I understand, and I'll go ahead and break here for just a bit. I understand that that this is not the happiest message for fundraisers. Okay, look, I get it, because if we lived in a world where we could just count it and forget it, which is what universities love to do, that would be a really comfortable world for fundraisers. Number one, you get to work with people your own age, right? And once you're in the plan, you're always in the plan. That makes my life as a fundraiser easier. Once I get in the plan, I can count it and forget it, move on to the next. So I get that this is not a happy message, right? Like the first section, that's a happy message. This section is, hey, I'm going to make your life a lot harder. Why don't you spend all your time with people who are 85 and older, right? See how much that makes your work go faster. But it's just kind of the reality that that we're looking at here in the data, that it is the real world, and I think it impacts the real dollars that are taking place here. So let me stop talking for a little bit, open it up for thoughts, comments, snide remarks, whatever comes to mind about any of this before we look at other stuff.
Okay, we got Bob Shaffis.
Yeah, I'll say something, which is we keep talking about this in terms of talking to leadership, but I've managed fairly large plan giving staffs, and some of the people who really need to hear this are the people who are in the front lines doing the plan giving, because they're so focused on some of the same things you were just talking about, the recency of giving and all that sort of stuff. And they need to hear that people who gave $1,000 a year consistently 10 years ago or more are people that they should be looking at very carefully right now to make sure they don't fall off that grid. That's my comment.
Well, and also let me add to that, there's a really cool study, and I need to find the link to it, that was done in England, where they actually did this deep dive to try to figure out these people who left gifts to the charity that were not donors. In other words, they're showing up as, okay, they left a gift, but we don't have them in our database. It turns out when they actually investigated that the people were connected to the organization somehow. They were volunteers. They had received services. They had this connection. And so I think it kind of points out this idea that if we can age stratify, anytime you've got somebody that's got a history, that's a friend of the organization, we need to stay top of the mind with those friends, right? And it's and it doesn't have to be asking for the $20 gift. We can stay top of the mind other ways. But I think we've got to, in this window, if we've got people that have that connection with the organization, we've got to get creative about staying top of the mind. Now, look, there's some organizations that they don't have to, because they represent an age-related cause and they dominate the market for their particular age-related cause. Okay. And so they get the freebies. But if you're not just getting everything for free, so to speak, I think it's important that you intentionally stay top of the mind within this window, and that can just be letting them know what's going on, cool things that are happening, as long as folks are thinking about that.
I have a comment as well, or a question, I guess. So maybe you mentioned this, I joined a few minutes late, but when is it best to ask to be included? Because you obviously don't want to say, hey, we gauge you to have about 18 more months, so now's a really good time for me to ask you to add us in there. So is there any indication of when it's best to be added, so that what we have is PG silent? So we're stewarding these folks whose current giving has dropped off, but they have a high chance that we're in the estate plan. When do we want to be put in there to remain?
Right. So, when we look at what actually triggers these additions and deletions, they tend to be triggered by these life events that generally group into the two categories of family structure changes or death becomes real. The family structure changes is birth of a first child, first grandchild, widowhood, marriage, divorce. Death becomes real is a negative diagnosis, such as cancer, first diagnosis of cancer, heart disease, stroke, or they're actually approaching the end of life. Now, the reality is, for most of our donors, we don't know when these things happen. So the answer, I think, is it's not a one-shot deal. We've got to stay communicating, stay top of the mind. And we can do that. It doesn't always have to be with the hard ask. It can be sharing stories. And because we're talking about death-related topics, oftentimes it's best to share the stories in what I like to call a guerrilla fashion. In other words, you do hit and run stories where you've got a donor story talking about, hey, here's something that the donor's done. They've been involved, and isn't that cool? Oh, by the way, they've also included the organization with the gift in their will. Here's why they're, and they're sharing why they did that, and then back to the main story. So it can be very kind of natural additions where we're talking about other people like you who like to include gifts in their wills that support the organization. So I think you can do this sort of consistent messaging that doesn't have to lead with death. There are other ways that you can share stories about that that just kind of always keep it at the top of the mind, because you don't know when that's going to happen. And even if you did know when it was going to happen, I don't know that you would use that as a I don't know that you'd want to specifically tie that into the reason why you're asking very specifically right now. I don't know. Other folks have other thoughts on approaches with that?
I have a comment.
Pamela, yeah.
How are you,
Doing
Russell?
well. Good to
I wish
see
I
you.
put lipstick on. It's good to see you all. What a mistake. I would say that in terms of selling it in the shop, these lead to repeat gifts. The estate plan is but one, and it is the final hurrah, and simplicity carries the day. Those of us in College Town, I promote modest beneficiary designations on a retirement plan relentlessly, because I see people volunteering. I see people on other boards. I profess the faith and do it. I think the universal way to talk about it is assets, and what your donors will tell you, if you let them small talk, are their problems. CDs are the leading investment choice in America, and everybody ought to try a gift annuity when they get older. I mean, I just pitched that idea to an attorney in Northern Indiana. She thought it was great, because who wants to look for a trustee for a CRT if she doesn't care about growth? It's all about what she wants. But assets and problems are the universal language to introduce it. That's absolutely it. And they will give you the lead for you to suggest the story that you've talked about, because nobody's heard of a gift annuity unless you've done one.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Pamela. And I think you know, I'm more coming to the realization that that is the answer, that it is that is starting to talk about gifts of assets. And whether we're talking about getting that plan in the will, or getting that IRA TOD, or getting that gift of stock, that we keep seeing these, what I would call, from a national data level, transformational behavioral changes. And they keep coming back to that concept that if you get the donor to stop thinking about, okay, gift to charity, gift to charity, what I just spent at Starbucks, right? And they start thinking about gift to charity, my wealth, my, you know, how what I have and what impact I want to make with the charity. That I think that there's something there that is the real driver, and it may be the driver that can also work inside the shop. That what we are talking about is major gifts of assets, okay? Because here's the thing. You can't do major gifts of assets unless you understand a bit of planned giving, right? Just can't do it, right? You cannot have a conversation about major gifts of assets if you don't know what a capital gains tax looks like. And so, you know, the more that these results are kind of coming out and piecing them together. And look, I'm slow. It takes me a while. People like Pamela, you've had this figured out for years, and us researchers, you know, it's just like, you know, oh, wait, maybe Pamela Davidson knew what she was talking about all along. But it is this, I think there's that sense there, and maybe there's a nugget that helps sell that internally as well, that what we are doing is promoting major gifts of assets, which can come in the estate, which can come through complex gifts, which can come through, and it's all about transforming the donor's mindset. Because I just got to say, you know, look, I've been in charitable giving academic research for a long time. And, you know, in experiments and in national data, a $50 increase is statistically significant. You know, that's fantastic. We love that. And we can talk theory about that all day long. But what we're seeing here is like, this is a different level. I mean, when, you know, when the giving is going up 78% and it's sustained at that level for 8 years, before versus after, that's massive. When the organizations are growing at a 6-fold faster rate when they include gifts of stocks as opposed to when they don't. I mean, these are sort of massive differences. And I think there's something underlying there about the donor psychology, but also something underlying there that can help make the case internally about why we should care about, and my new favorite phrase is major gifts of assets, because, you know, because that's what ties all these things together. The issue is, I think internally we've got, you know, look, the first thing they want to cut is the planned giving stuff, because yeah, that's going to hurt the organization, but that's not going to hurt the organization tomorrow, right? And by the way, I'm the decision maker, and I'm probably not going to be here in 5 years. I'm going to be somewhere else in 5 years. So that's technically we call that the agency problem. That's the problem, that if we just come at it from a, hey, let's get more gifts and wills, and won't it be great in 30 years, is that, you know, it'll be great for the organization, but will be great for your boss. And maybe if we transform that conversation to major gifts of assets, which transforms the donor mindset, so they begin thinking about gifts from wealth, which includes estate gifts. That's a great way to transform them thinking about gifts of wealth, but that it impacts us right now, you know, this year, next year. Let me throw that out there, because I'm just, you know, this is not anything formal. I'm just, how does that land with you all in trying to change the internal conversation from the language of we want bequest gifts to the language of we're all about major gifts of assets, and this is one flavor of it. But major gifts of assets will transform donor mindsets, and that can be helpful.
Well, let me just add a point to it. What changed the mindset of the organization I worked in is when we had lots of repeat gifts that were life stage gifts. And when they had to add to investment and to accounting and create a gift annuity program and a database because there was so much activity, that made them change the mindset. The way I think about it, my husband, my father, bankers, it's a diversification strategy. You know, when my cousin took her stock buyout bonus and bought a lake home that she dearly wanted, I said, you're trading an asset for an asset. And a lake home in Indiana probably will appreciate it. And they're there every single weekend of their lives. She said, you helped me so much. It's a diversification. I didn't go on a vacation. I have a different asset on my portfolio, and a gift annuity that provides income for life is that. A trust that's going to provide income is that. You know, a retained life estate or a term of years that means you don't have that burden. That's a diversification strategy. That's a plus on the economic side. And so when the organization sees that, when they see success, they're all over it. Because it's not one gift, it's the IRA charitable rollover is spendable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Russell, this is Emil.
Yeah, Emil.
Thanks for doing this. I had a question. I have not seen any statistics on a bequest program where they analyze the gifts by will versus will substitutes. Have you seen anything on that?
Yeah, so here's the thing we have on that. I do have a paper on that, but the data that I have is only on wills versus trusts. The one challenge we have right now is we have very little national data on the beneficiary designations, the TODs, PODs. Actually, I think Nathan's got the best data on that. You all, Stelter did some studies on that, and that's about it. I think Stelter's got essentially everything we have. So we don't know that. There is a huge difference between wills and funded trusts. In terms of people who during life say, yes, I've got a charitable component in my estate plan, and those who actually transfer dollars to charity at death. And the reason is that most people don't realize that the will document usually controls nothing. And this is from, I'm not just saying this is a story, this is actually from the National Representative Health and Retirement Study, that among those who within the final 2 years of life said that they had a signed and witnessed will document, the majority of those documents control no assets. Now, when the heirs are asked about the documents, they say, yes, they had a will, no, we didn't use it. And of course, the reason they didn't use it is that they left behind no assets that were titled solely in the name of the decedent with no TOD, POD, or joint ownership with right of survivorship. So I think most donors, and I'd put most fundraisers in there, don't realize that the will document's just a backup document, and it often controls nothing. Most of the time, it controls nothing. And then even if it does control something, it may be a very, very small segment of the something. So that's the reason why trusts were so powerful. Having a funded trust was so powerful at indicating whether the person was actually going to transfer dollars to charity at death. In fact, it was like the third leading indicator. You've got consistency of being a donor, childlessness, and then you've got whether or not they had a funded trust. Very, very powerful predictor of who's actually going to transfer dollars to charity at death. And I think part of it is just the misunderstanding that will documents, most of the time, they control nothing. And so, I mean, I always have fun with universities that's including my own, that, we have a very formal process for granting credit for your revocable state gift that you've got to send us a copy of the will document. I'm like, okay, it's all revocable. You know, do you want to nail your Jello to the wall with a big spike or a little pin? It doesn't matter. It's still Jello, right? But and beyond that, there's this issue that, you know, which I think comes back to exactly what Pamela was talking about, of how powerful it is to talk about things like, you know, if you want to leave a gift to charity, the best gift to start with is your IRA, because the kids get that, they got to pay taxes on income taxes on it, and in fact now they got to pay them even faster because of the new rules we've got this year, and that as a way to start talking about the asset conversation, because if you think you've won because I've got a copy of the will document and there's the line in there, you know, I mean, again, saying more things that make life harder for fundraisers. But the reality is, most of the time that will document's going to control nothing. And even if it does control, it's probably going to control a lot less than you think it does. Because what controls first is asset titling. And that's a much bigger deal now than it was before, because now just about everything west of the Mississippi and a good part of states east of the Mississippi, you can TOD real estate. Okay, that was the last piece. That was the last thing that wills were controlling, was the house. Now you can TOD the house. So what is the will, you know, what is it going to control? And the answer is usually nothing. You know, so I think it's a big deal that we have those asset conversations, because it's the individual asset titling that's actually controlling these estate gifts, not the will document. Now, obviously, if you get a funded trust, then you're trained that you've got to retitle everything, and then that controls it. But Emil, I think it's a really big deal, and it's another one of those areas where sometimes our metric systems aren't set up to deal with this reality of how you know, these gifts are not as simple as you might think that they are. Emil, do you have any thoughts on that, experiences you've had, or comments?
No, I think I almost look at donors and I put them in different categories. And if you look at the very high net worth donor, you're looking at a will and a trust. Usually high net worth donors are going to have a revocable living trust, I find is usually the case. And if they don't have one, they probably deserve one. But the thing that I've talked to a number of the charities about is that, and maybe Nathan has this kind of information, and I'm interested in seeing it, but, that when you get into the will area and charities helping donors with wills, it becomes quite problematic on a number of levels. Is the donor represented by an attorney who drafted the will? Is there undue influence? You get into, you know, unauthorized practice of law if the charity is doing it or has somebody that they paid to do it that's not licensed. So you get into a lot of those issues, and I think some of the complexity can go away if the planner focuses their attention on will substitutes, the paid on death, the you know, jointly owned, the beneficiary designation of the IRA, those kind of things. I think there's a tremendous amount of complexity is removed, and that's what I've advised a number of my clients.
Great points. Great points. Yeah.
Russell, I'd like to give you a challenge that we face in our nonprofit organizations and get your response. At the last Leadership Institute, after some in-depth discussion, it was determined that those nonprofit organizations that are going to thrive, they have an endowment, they have a solid gift planning program, they have the sophistication or the connections to accept non-cash assets, and all of their frontline fundraisers are trained in talking to donors about all three of those things. After that conversation, Cynthia Krause and I had some side conversations that, yeah, we've got our staff talking endowments, we've got our staff talking about estate gifts. We do not have of them talking about non-cash assets. How do we train them? So, I mean, you addressed this training a little bit, but looking just at that topic of non-cash assets, where people's wealth is, how can we train our frontline fundraisers to have those conversations?
So, two thoughts, and then I'll add something unrelated where I'll ask for help on a different issue. The first is, I think it is powerful for fundraisers to start by sharing stories. So if you can develop a story, it doesn't even have to be at your own organization. I was working with a friend who was working with a donor who blah, 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 right? Because good fundraisers, these are fantastic social people who are great at sharing stories. And so I think part of that training is to maybe write out, here's a story about a non-cash gift. And in that story, you're going to include the benefits, the avoidance of capital gains tax, right? One thing that I have found useful is I like to talk about the charitable swap. In other words, the idea that that a donor has shares of Apple stock, and they're like, well, I don't want to sell those shares. I don't want to give those shares because I want to stay in Apple stock. Recognizing the idea that they can donate those shares to Apple stock, and they can immediately, if they're appreciated shares, they can immediately repurchase identical shares of Apple stock. And it doesn't change the portfolio at all, but what it has done is it has wiped out the capital gains tax. So, and I will, this is an illustration that I use. Just this idea that to communicate to the donor that you don't need to change your portfolio. Okay. And of course, if you want to run it through a donor advised fund, you can run it through a donor advised fund. But if we don't want them to do that, then we just send it directly from the organization. So again, I think it comes back to just starting simple. And here's the second thing, and I think this is really important, and I think this has really helped our own fundraisers as I've been working with them each week, is to get the fundraiser to understand that the purpose of the conversation is not to give the right answer. The purpose of the conversation is to set up the next meeting. In other words, you want to be able to communicate that there are these opportunities, and we can put together some ideas for you to look at, so that they don't feel like, because sometimes there's a sense that fundraisers feel like, oh, I got to be quick with the right answer. And that's, that's not me. I'm not, I don't have all that tax law floating around in my head like that. And in fact, that's the exactly wrong thing. We don't want to give the right answer immediately. What we want is we want to have the next conversation, right? So we want to be able to train the donors to share a story, and then if a question comes up, to say, we've got some great people at our organization who could put together a bunch of different answers for you to take a look at. Do you mind if we set up a time to get back together and talk about that again? Because fundamentally, that's actually better fundraising, even if you knew the answer right away. So I would suggest those things. I like your thumbs up, Kent. Thanks for that. Okay, let me say one last thing, because here's where I want to ask for help from you guys. If you read through these law review articles, and I posted the link to the other one since you have, because I had 2 law review articles come out in the same 5-day period of time. And they're both on the same topic. One deals with this study, the other deals with probate and tax records. In both of them, I try to make this point. If we can do one thing that would be transformational for our industry, here's what I think it would be. The reason that legacy gifts are so much higher in the UK relative to all other forms of giving than they are in the US, in my belief, is fundamentally because they know what every single organization is getting in their bequest gifts, okay? It's every single will document in the country is read, calculated, you can buy the report. You know what your competitor is doing, okay? And if you are getting your butt kicked, you know it. And nonprofit managers respond to that, okay? Right now, organizations have to report 26 different specific types of non-cash gifts, as well on the Form 990, as well as reporting cash from fundraising events separately, and cash from all sorts of other, I mean, it's lots and lots of reporting. If anybody knows anybody who could get some influence that we add that one line to the 990, gifts from estates, that could be transformational. And the reason I say that is I will tell you how I got Texas Tech to start caring about non-cash gifts. I showed them the 990 for what Iowa State was doing, and Iowa State's kicking our butt, right? And I'm like, because the 990s show how much you're getting in non-cash gifts. You can find a competitor who's getting more than you are, and you can take that 990, it's all free online, and you can say, here's what our competitor got in non-cash gifts, and we got jack, right? Because the nonprofit managers, they are risk-averse herd animals, okay, to say it nicely, okay? So if you can show them somebody else is already doing it and we're not, that's very powerful. You can use it with non-cash gifts already, but if we got to a point where we knew what everybody was doing, I think that would be transformational, because I think then organizations would start to see, oh, wait a second, they're getting so much more money from bequests, which we don't share that information right now, right? It's all kind of, we keep it hidden and private and that sort of thing. But industry-wise, if we could add that component to the 990, I think it would be transformational, because I've seen how it works with non-cash gifts, because I've done it, because they let me stand in front of our board of trustees for the foundation, say, hey, guess who's kicking our butt? We don't like to lose to Iowa State. I know Nathan feels the same way. And it made a big difference to show what the competitor was doing. And for non-cash assets, we can do the same thing, finding competitor that's doing it better. And, you know, it's all public record. If we had that for bequest gifts, I think that'd be transformational. I'm over time. Sorry about that. I get excited about tax forms. Michael, I'll give it back to you.
Russell, we appreciate your excitement, and thank you so much for doing this. Thank you, everybody who joined us. Any closing comments, Michael?
Yeah, I did want to have Babs Yeager, our Director of Education, talk about some webinars that we have coming up, because it's all, you know, all this stuff is coming together and tied together. So before we come off, go ahead, Babs, if you would.
Thanks, Michael. I just want to give you a quick heads up about specifically about two programs that are going to hit our webinar schedule in the remainder of this year. The first one's coming up in July, and it's a panel discussion about making the internal case for a gift planning program, basically, and that includes using data from your own program and data from other programs, including maybe those non-cash, you know, receipts from the 990, to convince powers that be that they should invest in a gift planning program. So Catherine Myrie and Phil Purcell and Alex Brovey are on that panel, and they're going to talk about things that they've seen work at their organizations or organizations that they've advised. So highly recommend that. And then we also have a program coming up toward the end of the year on increasing non-cash fundraising, basically. And Jackie Franey is doing a presentation on that subject at our conference, and she is convening a panel to talk about what's going on at the Nature Conservancy and also some other organizations that have actually had some success in kind of shifting the culture and training fundraisers to talk about non-cash gifts. So look for those programs in our shop. And there will be a lot of sharing going on in the chat during those programs. So you'll probably hear about other programs in addition to the ones that are talked about during the panels. So just want to let you know about that. Hope to see you on those programs.
Great, thanks, Babs. And thank you so much, Russell, for spending time with us today. We always appreciate the opportunity to hear from you and hear your passion. It's always inspiring to us as well. So thanks so much. Kent, do you have any final words?
Just so good to see everybody. This is a pleasure to get together with my peeps. I love these. Please join us again in 2 weeks. As Michael said, we'll be doing these every other Friday. And you all have a good weekend. Thank you.
Thank you.